Hello, I'm Kelvin Ross, and I'm going to talk today about how we're building out our medical AI data platform on AWS. I'm the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer for Datarwe, and Datarwe is a company working with Queensland Health to build a medical data platform for research, and particularly a platform that we can share data with other medical researchers, particularly around AI-enabled medical innovation. My details are on the screen, and I'd be more than happy to get in contact and discuss what we're doing and how we can collaborate. My colleague in Queensland Health, Dr. Brent Richards, Medical Director for Innovation at Gold Coast University Hospital, describes AI as the third A in healthcare revolution. First we had antibiotics, then we had anesthesia, and now AI he sees as the next revolution in healthcare. But most of us would be familiar with healthcare that really is focused around a lot of our experience around imaging. So we've seen things like analysing chest x-rays, looking for pneumonias, analysing mammograms, looking for breast cancer tumours, analysing pathology slides, and even using Android phones. A famous Stanford case study where we could analyse skin lesions looking for cancers. But if we think about where we can apply AI, there's many other areas much broader than imaging that we can apply AI. And in particular, what I'll talk about today is where we're extracting a lot of physiological information in a medical record, an electronic medical record. I might call that, I'll refer to that as an EMR. And that's a little bit different to elastic MapReduce, but I'll probably use those two terms a little bit interchangeably. But we've got this rich data coming out of a hospital. How do we use AI to analyze what actions we should take with the goal of really delivering people out of hospital healthier, quicker? I just wanted to touch on the kinds of studies that have been enabled from this deeper sort of time series physiological data that's being recorded as opposed to imaging data. One of the real classic studies that was reported was the TRUE score out of Johns Hopkins. And again, there you can see in the application where we had lots of physiological measurements being collected over time. And the TRUE score tries to predict, is this patient going to fall into septic shock? So collecting data from ICU, we can get a heads up 20 hours before a person falls into a septic shock to start our interventions earlier. And septic shock is the largest killer of people in intensive care. We've got better over the years, but probably 10% of people who get sepsis don't survive. And the earlier we can start treatment, the more effective that it can, the outcome can be. Further studies have gone on in a similar area to look at, well, if we can identify in advance a patient that is beginning to deteriorate, can we use AI to almost to give us practical advice about what level of drugs that we should be giving to that person to most increase their chances of recovering from the disease? And so this study looked at reinforcement learning and AI and was another groundbreaking paper published in Nature Medicine. And what they found is that typically across all ICUs that they did the study on, that it's a tendency that we tend to underprescribe vasopressors as a blood pressure drug and oversubscribe fluids, and really it's suggesting that we should change our treatments a little bit there. You can see in this study, we're looking at high frequency data from an ECG device. And this study found that we can detect a range of quite critical arrhythmias, such as atrial fibrillation and tachycardias and so on. And those can be actually predicted more accurately from the data than what a trained cardiologist can do. So we've now got this ability that AI could watch these signals and give sort of accurate medical advice and assist the doctors. So one would think that AI is just around the corner, that we've got this data that we might be collecting from our wearable devices, and now we just send that data up into the cloud, and surely now we're ready for this medical revolution. But we definitely have some challenges about how we connect the data that we're connecting to the disease and then use machine learning to make those predictions. So one of the first challenges is that we need a lot of data. What we've found over time is that machine learning has been useful in building these predictive models and so on. But as we've moved into techniques like deep learning, we're able to achieve much higher levels of accuracy, but the requirement is we need a lot more data to do that. And really one of our problems is worldwide is that there is a shortage of data available, and not just data, there's plenty of data available from Fitbits and Apple iWatches and things like that are the raw data, but what we're missing is all the labeled data that connects that data with disease progression and so on. So really we're talking about connected data where we're going from the raw foundational data and connecting that with diseases and drug admissions and administrations and things like that. So one of the advantages of ICU is, again, we've got no shortage of data. We can build those models, but a key is actually having sort of the outcomes and what actions we've undertaken and connecting that back to the data. And as we close the loop with machine learning, we find that machine learning is helping us to identify new labels and new outcomes that we're then feeding into the future as a predictive model. So ICU is a good place to start because we've got that sort of connected ecosystem, and the models that we can learn in ICU, I think over time we will be able to transfer that to then patients in other parts of the hospital and ultimately patients going home after they've been admitted to the hospital and watching for whether they might deteriorate. So continue on those challenge areas. Yes, there is lots of data, but what we find in most hospitals is most of that data goes unused. So some reports here from a couple of years ago was that data within hospitals is doubling every 2 years. The majority of that data is imaging data. Things like MRIs create massive amounts of data, but equally you can see there, you know, a lot of the streaming data from all the other devices and so on. But the reality is that a very small amount of that data actually gets labeled and tagged for later reuse in studies and advancing medical research. So one of the challenges to overcome is how do we start making that data more accessible for research? In order to do that, we can see that there's these problems. First of all, the data's in different locations, they're in different systems. We might have systems like Cerner and Epic and Allscripts, and we're using MetaVision for ICU. And each of those have different formats and so on. So interoperability and finding it and connecting the data is quite key. Even within one hospital, we might have imaging in one system, we've got ICU in another, and then we've got our medical notes in Cerner, and then so we've got to be able to connect that data together. The second challenge is that data, getting access to that data is onerous. There's a lot of fears around data privacy. So we need to have those processes in place that give us good governance, that data is protected, that privacy is locked down, and really under those protocols of legitimate medical research, are we giving access to data in the right way? Even once we've got all that data connected and made available, we still need to clean that data. There's a lot of noise and we need to add value to it. We need to add new labels and correct things and reshape the data in different ways. And then even once we've done all that, if we build a model, for instance, the true score out of, say, it was trained off the MIMIC data set out of the Beth Israel Hospital, we build a really well-performing model there. When we find we take that model and try to apply it, say, here in Australia on our data, the way we prescribe drugs and the way the processes operate within the hospital, and even perhaps some different ethnic differences and things like that, means that that algorithm really needs to be calibrated to our local data and our local modalities. So even once that bit's done, it's very important for hospitals still to be able to share their data so they can adopt different technologies and test that before they deploy that into a clinical environment. So there's a number of these steps to move through to move data forward. So let me come back to that sort of challenge earlier. So a lot of our focus has been on this time series data in the medical record, but also adding to that a lot of the devices from that sit around the patient in starting in ICU. So it might come as a surprise to most people that the data that comes off the bedside monitor when you're all wired up, we do write some aggregate values into the medical record there. In our hospital, every minute we write that data, and in some places it might only be every 15 minutes, where we get an average of the heart rate and so on. But the lower level high frequency data, which captures a lot of clinical value, is not kept. It's effectively goes to the trash can, and so we're actually losing a lot of valuable information that's quite critical to some of the medical research and studies that we want to undertake. So those challenges, the problems that I outlined, were a key thing that we wanted to work on in Datarwe to build a platform where we share data that we collect across the hospital, and in addition to the technical platform which I'm talking about today, also making sure that we operate that platform in a secure and governed approach. So we're meeting those sort of obligations that we've got in terms of doing maintaining privacy as well as undertaking legitimate ethical research. But the fundamentals of the platform is extracting data from data sources. So from some of our end applications like MetaVision and Cerner, but also collecting information from different devices, loading that into a data lake, and ultimately what we want to see is a data ocean, how we enrich data and then build tool sets to enable medical research. So at the end of the day, different researchers can undertake these projects for things like early warning scores for disease, or how we might treat with certain drugs. But providing a platform so that each of these researchers don't need to come back and manage this back-end area. So AWS is our key partner in this space. We've chosen to really focus on Python as a platform that appears to be a fairly common platform now for data science and machine learning. And in some of the machine learning, deep learning frameworks are things like TensorFlow and PyTorch that we're using on top of things like the SageMaker environment. But as I said, in building up, there's a lot of work and foundations that need to be put in place to first of all collect that data, but then ready it for the researchers to do their work. So at the end of the day, every researcher wants to be doing this piece at the top of the pyramid of building their machine learning models and building their predictive models, and then ultimately getting that back into the hospital as adding value. But there's a lot of this foundational work, and in our data platform in AWS, we're using these standard services, things like S3 for landing data, Lambda for processing data, Athena for really giving us that ability to query and analyze the data that's within our data lake, and then ultimately building on top of that with SageMaker and some of the comprehension, the cognitive tools like Comprehend Medical and so on that we're using in data de-identification. So let me run through a little bit of that background. And just before I go into that, and the goal, we've started off with one hospital with very deep data. The goal is to try to build up these large medical research sets. So there are some around internationally, like Mimic's a very well used one out of Boston with MIT. But the difference what we're doing is ultimately going much deeper in the data to give that really getting down to the high frequency data. So our next goal is really how do we progress that? So our initial piece of work with the Queensland government is to roll this out across all Queensland hospitals to get a very large data set, and then we aim to go to other hospitals, perhaps first around Australia and then internationally to really create this data lake. So that key of getting down to the high frequency data, that's very important. And the reason is that there's a lot of that registry data. In the previous slide I had ANZICS has information about 1.4 million patients, but not many features. Again, it's been quite useful for research as a registry, but when you want to start drilling into diseases and actually what happens to the patient over time, it has limited feature values. If we drill into things like ANZICS would have the high and low heart rate for their first 24 hours as a feature, and people sort of collect that registry data and send it into the intensive care college, But you can see if we look at things like Mimic would have 15-minutely observations, you can see there's a lot of change in behavior of the patient over that first 24 hours. But if we look at these sort of instances, you might feel that we're within a safe range, but if we actually drill into the data, we see within that 15 minutes, there's even further fluctuation, that maybe there's a lot of uncharacteristic behavior of the patient that we really want to drill into, because it's quite critical to their physiological outcome. So we need to go deeper into that data, and ultimately drilling down to the high frequency data where we actually see arrhythmias. So for each of these data points at 1 minute, there's literally tens of thousands of values if we go down to 240 hertz, and then you can start tying in arrhythmia research, which is quite a well studied area in cardiology. So to collect that streaming data, our first step in the data platform was to build an ingestion agent that communicates with different IoT devices in their high-speed data ports, and sends that through Kinesis Firehose to get that landed in Amazon in S3. Once it's landed in S3, we can then start transforming that data with either lambdas or other elastic MapReduce type processes to actually reshape that data. So we might be pulling off many streams of data. We've got ECG with multiple leads at 240 hertz. We've got blood pressure data at 90 hertz, so we can see the change in blood pressure from their arterial line, saturation of oxygen, and so on. So that was the key, is first of all starting with those devices. But if you looked around the ICU ward, you'd see many other devices that would be important to start collecting information. Infusion pumps injecting drugs, things like cranial pressure monitors for people who've had head injuries. We've got things like cameras and so on, all part of that process where we want to build up that deep information about what's happening to a patient during their ICU stay. But a good start then is we've got that data landed in S3. We can process that. You know, this is like a Zeppelin sort of view. We could feed that into other analytics visualization tools like QuickSight or Power BI and so on to start giving behavior. But that's really the first step as well, about then how we might interact in the wearable space. So we've got one of our partners is Cardia, the Alive Tech people, the technology people behind this product are local here in Australia. And again, they've got 20 million 30-second ECG data, and getting your head around that data and how we might learn from those models into the hospital and vice versa is a very important step. And similarly, we've worked in studies where we're collecting field data with ECG from truck drivers over long periods driving trucks, and we collect that ECG data that gets uploaded into S3 in our data lake. And once it's landed, we can then run other tools across that. For instance, a key part to analysing ECG for arrhythmias is what's called heart rate variability. A bit different to heart rate that you see on your Fitbit. I'm now got a heart rate of 75. Heart rate variability is really about measuring the precise RR intervals between the R peaks that you see in an ECG, and that gives very good diagnostic information about arrhythmias. What we found though is in a clean signal in the hospital that works is fairly straightforward to use traditional tools. Once you move to wearables, this is where deep learning starts coming in as a tool set that enables us to deal with anomalies and irregularities and sort of throw away the noisy data and deal with it in a cleaner way. So we see deep learning as a critical tool set to not only doing this low-level analysis that enables research, but also at the end of the day, a bit like the Stanford study, building deep learning models of particular arrhythmia detection and so on. So there's a lot of work we've done around the IoT data and ingesting that into our Amazon data lake. Data from our medical record systems, our electronic medical records, not elastic MapReduce, but typically they're in relational databases, so we ingest those into our data lake, and we go through that process of then transformation of trying to label and match up data. Some of that labeling might be manual labeling by clinicians and nurses, and then we can go through a cycle of building models to make predictions or to add new labels. And this tends to be a sort of a virtuous cycle, that once we've built up those lower level labels, that might feed into the next level of research. So we're going through this process of enriching and adding to that data, and ultimately it might be the end user from a particular drug company or researchers looking at medical approaches or medical devices would maybe take our labels and focus more on that value-added model at the end. So the way that we typically manage this is we tend to land the relational data into S3 buckets, and so again, we'd have from our different medical record systems, perhaps the relational structure of the data that gets ingested from different sites. We tend to then partition that based on the hospital and the units and so on, so we can then track across many hospitals and so on. The data can get landed as CSV data, Parquet data, and so on, and process that quite efficiently. So the Amazon platform is actually quite a good, cost-effective and sort of elastically scalable platform for dealing with this amount of data from many hospitals and many sites. Once that data is landed, we find Athena's a very useful, powerful tool that pretty much with the refresh of Athena, any new data uploaded now is fully sort of queryable using Presto, so we can run SQL-like queries across that data, join data, link data, and so on. And then Athena tends to be our access point then for machine learning models. In the machine learning models, the approach we're taking with the data platform is we want to add better security and privacy to the data, and the security models that we can build around the AWS cloud are very powerful here. So instead of allowing people to export data, more what we do is we invite people to log in to a zoned area, and the approach that we're finding quite powerful at the moment is our machine learning partners. We spin up SageMaker instances for them. Those instances are very much locked down to named people who they can access and see and start and stop those instances. And then typically they're using either sort of Jupyter notebook style interfaces, or they're using their interaction with their Git libraries through AWS code commit and things like that. So we've got that very good control of data within those environments that are locked down, so data doesn't leave those controlled environments. As I mentioned earlier, Python's our sort of go-to programming language for building out machine learning models. That being said, we could still manage that through R notebooks and things like that as well. But in here we find Python quite powerful for building quite versatile models, whether we're perhaps pulling down existing models from SageMaker or we're building models from scratch by spinning up PyTorch or TensorFlow. But one of the first things that you typically do, or whenever you're undertaking any project, is we might build a model, but we've actually got to go and inspect patients. And so we've built a bunch of libraries within notebooks that enable people to view the data. So the patient viewer is quite a powerful class library that enables our users to go in and chart out how patients are progressing. So we can drill into a patient, and this is all, by the way, is de-identified data, so it's been through a de-identification pipeline, and ultimately we can drill into a particular de-identified patient and find out the heart rate data that we've got minutely, or you can see here we've had some manual observations of non-invasive blood pressures that the nurses are taking at certain rates, and even when they replace the ECG leads on a patient, that gets noted. So there's quite a lot of data that gets recorded throughout the patient's stay in ICU. So this particular patient's got 7 days in ICU. The darker blue shows the first 24 hours. So you can get a feeling for how a patient's sort of progressing through their data, and you can really drill down if you want to for that low level detail. But as you start building a study, so one of the research studies is looking at how different early warning scores for septic shock, like the TRUE score, might apply on our hospital data. We then start sort of trying to build out our study. So the first thing you want to work out is what's the cohort of data, what constitute someone being part of this study. Do they have sepsis? Do they have septic shock? And then as a modeler, you start building up the routine. So we'd start observing different things. You can see here where a key feature of septic shock is their blood pressure levels. If they drop down to a certain threshold, that's an indicator, along with the administration of vasopressors, so like noradrenaline. So those would be indicators of this patient being a member of a cohort for the septic shock study. But as I mentioned before, there's this enriching and adding data. So we've added these classes to visualize, but what we want to do is in the back end, add lots more labels and data so each researcher is not doing the same thing. So it's very common to have, say, we want to rebucket all of our studies into hourly buckets of what their average observations were or how much drug of a particular drug was dosed in that particular hour. So there's a lot of reshaping data. We can do that within Athena, or we could build Python and run that through Lambda scripts. And things like SOFA and Apache scores that are severity scores, those might be generated so we can have standard ways of that that clinicians are used to observing how patients' severity tracks over time. So those are sort of standardized scoring systems. But what you often find when you look at the data, you've got that anomalous data. So there's spurious values that perhaps need to be thrown away. So we need strategies for how we clean that data. And also things like we've got to impute missing values where, you know, this might normally be done every day or in Apache's typically only the first 24 hours. If we're doing this every hour, then we need strategies of sort of imputing missing values, and that's a lot of the enrichment that we can do. So you can see through the data platform, what we've tried to do is take it from where data is inaccessible, not being stored, it's private data, and ultimately we're trying to progress it through this maturity to the point where we're getting to this level A maturity for medical research data, where at the end of the day, it's been de-identified, it's structured, it's cleaned, and it's labeled, annotated, and it's ready for the researcher to undertake their task. Now, it's been about a 2 or 3 year process of getting the engagement of our public health system to make sure the appropriate controls and everything are in place, and we just got all this data lake and everything stood up, and all of a sudden COVID-19 came along, and very rapidly the state's health system said, oh my God, okay, great, we've got this medical research study. So very quickly it was repurposed then into an operational reporting data lake as well. And so part of that is looking at things like for managing ICU bed capacities, how might we now extract our data lake to extract out these values, for instance, SOFA and Apache scores I was just talking about. How do we give those in real time? So we update a dashboard every half hour of recent data, and we can present in real time the occupancy of our ICU units and how patients are progressing, you know, what their current status is, but how they progressed over the last 7 days. So one of the challenges, we've been quite fortunate here in Australia not to have our ICUs get overwhelmed like we've seen in other countries like the UK and the US. But a big part is predicting discharge time and things like that. So for clinical people, it's really about how much longer is a particular patient going to be occupying beds within ICU, and when might new beds become available for future patients to come into there. So that was a key project. It's still underway, that project. We're using a lot of machine learning as well to help do those predictions about how much longer occupancy is going to take. Key to all of this is how we control our security to manage privacy as data is shared. So, you know, a hospital in making its data available, the first step is landing our data in AWS, but really that's an account still owned by the hospital. So again, the privacy elements is the hospital would land their data in an AWS cloud, but that's still very much controlled by the hospital with PHI data. And, you know, making sure the security is very much locked down. So something like the COVID or the planning dashboard would still be reported from within that cloud. But ultimately, as we move to share data with other researchers, you know, under our legislation and compliance and sort of the research requirements, is making sure we have that assurance that we go through de-identification and so on. And again, the Amazon security model enables us to define new security zones, and we can ensure that before data is moved from one zone to the other, it's passed through that those gates of making sure appropriate de-identification steps are there. But also the security zone enables us to lock down actually what can people do within that zone as well, so we can prevent, for instance, data leaving those environments and so on. Our next piece of work is really starting to look at things like a lot of the unstructured data that we have, and things like we might see pathology reports or other toxicology reports and so on that are in semi-formatted text, but also a really key one for many researchers are seeing the clinicians' notes, and so from the doctors and nurses, their actual notes, which are a bit more in natural language. And a key to that is really how do we extract information, extract features out of unstructured data. And again, we're finding various tool sets. You can start off with things like regular expressions if it's semi-formatted through parsing. But ultimately, as you have less formatting or more complex rules, things like Amazon Comprehend Medical for things like entity extraction and so on, those kinds of frameworks become quite versatile. And similarly, de-identification is a key part of this. So looking at unstructured data where there might be patient identifiable information in there. Again, with tools like Amazon Comprehend Medical, there's one of the APIs is PHI identification. That's a key part of the product for identifying and running us through that filter to make sure all data has been de-identified. The data enrichment process I talked about briefly, but you can see, just reiterating the core platforms as we're doing this value add work of things like Lambda, Athena, and then what we're doing within SageMaker and Amazon Comprehend Medical. I also want to briefly mention SageMaker Ground Truth as well, because part of those labels and verification of labels needs that validation or extraction by clinical people, doctors and nurses, and we're investigating and running projects where we're looking at integrating ground truth labeling into that as well. So the goal for us is really to roll this out statewide. Now, we had a sort of a stage plan and funding over this. COVID's actually accelerated that quite dramatically, so we're probably likely to have statewide data sets literally within months, or a few months, instead of sort of many months or even years. So in some ways, COVID's created this rapid data sharing emphasis internationally about how we're going to share data to particularly solve the COVID problem. But I think this data sharing has been viewed as creating more international collaboration will help us in the future for many other disease types apart from COVID-19. The next step as well is how do we scale that from the ICU to other areas, and the challenge there is just the scale of data that we've got to deal with. So first of all, we have to develop models that can be transferred, but then we need a data platform that has the ability to scale from tens of patients in each hospital to hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands once you think about a community care model with aged care or other vulnerable people in the community being monitored to the level that we could do with AI. And if we roll that out across each hospital, we are really talking about a deluge of data and technologies, but there is no way we could do that without AI. Unlike ICU, where we can put an ICU nurse in every room, we can't do that with every patient sitting at home. AI is the solution to that. So the key points to just wrap up my presentation. Well, first of all, I think you can see through here that big data and AI is really key to that future medical innovation. But just having big data is not enough, and having AI is not enough. Those processes for access to data and cleaning to data and enrichment required are really key to making advances in this area, and that's what Datarwe's key goal has been about. And we've found basically the AWS infrastructure, now we've finally got the capabilities through cloud to be able to do this and manage this. I think, 4 or 5 years ago, to do this was almost insurmountable. But as you can see, we're just at the tip of the iceberg of both the models and the capabilities that we'll build out in the future, but also the amount of data and where we can apply this throughout our community. So where to from here? I'm really asking anybody watching this webinar to come and join us, come on board as a research collaborator. If you want to get involved in how data might be shared, we'd love to talk to you and share our experiences. So look, that's it for me. My contact details are there, Kelvin Ross at datarwe.com. Also, if you want to reach out on Twitter, I post a lot of things I read that are really influencing our thinking, and but we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.